Now listen closely. What kind of man gets arrested nearly 100 times? Not for crime, not for violence, but for praying for the sick. At the turn of the 20th century, when medicine was law and doctors held authority, one preacher openly defied the system. He claimed God still healed bodies. He told the sick to choose faith over prescriptions. And crowds followed him by the thousands. His name was John Alexander Dowie. To some, he was a miracle worker. To others, a dangerous fanatic. To authorities, a problem that would not go away. This is not a story about easy faith or simple heroes. It's a story about power, belief, persecution, and what happens when conviction refuses to bend. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it because stories like this are rarely told honestly, and they deserve to be heard. Now, let's begin. If you had walked the streets of Chicago at the turn of the 20th century, you would have heard whispers before you ever saw him. Some called him a madman, others called him a menace. Many called him a fraud, but tens of thousands ordinary men and women crushed under the weight of disease called him something else entirely. They called him a healer. This is the story of John Alexander Dowie, a man who was arrested nearly 100 times not for theft, not for violence, not for rebellion, but for daring to pray for the sick when the law said he must not. To understand why a preacher could become one of the most arrested men in American religious history, we must begin far from the courtroom, far from the shouting crowds and newspaper headlines, and travel back to the quiet origins of a conviction that would eventually collide with medicine, government, and public fear. John Alexander Dowie was born in 1847 in Edinburgh, Scotland, the son of a Presbyterian minister. Faith was not foreign to him. Scripture was not a mystery. Religion was the language of his home. Yet Dowie's early life was not marked by fanaticism or visions. By all accounts, he was intelligent, observant, and deeply sensitive to suffering. That sensitivity would be sharpened by tragedy. In his young adulthood, Dowie emigrated to Australia, where he served as a congregational pastor. It was there, while ministering during a devastating outbreak of disease, that something in him shifted permanently. He watched doctors move helplessly from home to home. He watched families bury their dead. And he watched faith retreat into polite sermons that offered comfort, but no expectation of intervention. Dowie could not reconcile the Jesus of the Gospels with the resignation of the church. He read Scripture obsessively. He lingered over passages others skimmed. They brought to him all who were sick, and he healed them all. These signs shall follow those who believe. What if these were not metaphors? What if healing was not a relic of the past, but a neglected command? The crisis came when Dowie himself fell gravely ill. Conventional treatment failed him. Doctors offered little hope. And in that moment, hovering between life and death, Dowie made a vow that would define the rest of his existence. If God healed him, he would preach divine healing as a living reality. According to Dowie's own testimony, that healing came. And once it did, he could never return to silence. By the time he arrived in the United States in the 1880s, Dowie was no longer just a preacher. He was a man possessed by an idea dangerous enough to threaten established systems. That God still healed bodies without medical mediation. Chicago was fertile ground for controversy. Industrial expansion had packed the city with immigrants, laborers, and the urban poor. Disease spread easily. Hospitals were overcrowded. Medical science was advancing but unevenly, and public trust was fragile. Into this environment stepped Dowie, declaring that sickness was not inevitable, and that prayer was not symbolic. He did not begin with stadiums or banners. He began with homes, with bedsides, with whispered prayers offered to people who had exhausted every other option. And something happened. People claimed to be healed. Tumors vanished, chronic pain lifted, the paralyzed stood. The blind reported sight, the dying lived. Whether one believes every testimony or not, what cannot be denied is the scale. Crowds grew, demand exploded, Word spread faster than authorities could contain it, and that is when the arrests began. At first, they were minor. Charges of practicing medicine without a license, public nuisance laws, disturbing the peace. Each arrest was followed by release. Each release was followed by more crowds. Dowie refused to stop praying. To the medical establishment, he was dangerous. Not because he healed, but because he undermined trust in institutional authority. Patients were choosing prayer over prescriptions. That was intolerable. To city officials, he was disruptive. His meetings clogged streets. His followers defied orders. His reputation drew national attention. To newspapers, he was a headline machine. They mocked him relentlessly. Cartoons depicted him as a false prophet. Editorials warned of mass delusion. But to the sick, he was hope. By the time Dowie organized the Christian Catholic Apostolic Church, his healing ministry had moved from informal prayer to public declaration. He preached that sickness was an enemy Christ had already defeated. He instructed followers to abandon tobacco, alcohol, and medical dependence. He established healing homes where prayer replaced treatment. Every one of these actions increased the pressure. Arrests multiplied. Police would interrupt services mid-prayer. Dowie would be dragged from pulpits while congregants wept and sang hymns. He was fined, jailed, released, rearrested. At one point, Dowie kept a running count. Nearly 100 times, and yet, with every arrest, attendance grew. This was not merely a legal conflict. It was a collision of worldviews. Was the human body a machine governed solely by science, or was it a vessel under divine authority? Could the state regulate prayer when prayer produced results medicine could not explain? Dowie did not see himself as opposing doctors. He saw himself as obeying God, and obedience to Him outranked reputation, safety, and even reason, but conviction has consequences. The man who would not stop healing would soon become the man who would not stop challenging authority, not only medical authority, but political, religious, and eventually divine authority itself. And as his influence expanded, so would his certainty. In the next section, we will step inside the courtrooms, headlines, and public confrontations that transformed Dowie from a persecuted healer into a national religious phenomenon and set him on a path that would elevate him higher than any of his contemporaries and place him closer to collapse than he ever imagined. Because the same fire that fuels faith can also consume restraint. By the time John Alexander Dowie became a familiar name in Chicago courtrooms, something unusual had happened. The arrests that were meant to silence him had instead become his loudest microphone. Every time Dowie was hauled before a judge, newspapers followed. Every time newspapers followed, curiosity grew. And every time curiosity grew, the crowds multiplied. What began as a fringe healing ministry was rapidly becoming a national spectacle. Chicago authorities believed they were dealing with a simple legal problem. In their view, Dowie was practicing medicine without a license. He laid hands on the sick. He advised them to refuse drugs. He accepted offerings. To the city, this was not faith, it was fraud dressed in scripture. But Dowie refused the label outright. "I do not practice medicine," he declared repeatedly. "I practice prayer." That distinction mattered deeply to him and terrified the courts because prayer was not something the law knew how to regulate. You could license doctors, you could inspect hospitals, but how do you outlaw belief without violating the very freedoms America claimed to protect? Judges struggled, prosecutors fumbled, charges were filed, dropped, refiled under new wording. One week Dowie was accused of fraud, another week of disorderly conduct, another week of endangering public health. The result was chaos and Dowie thrived in it. He turned courtrooms into pulpits. Instead of pleading quietly, he preached boldly. Instead of apologizing, he accused. He framed every arrest as proof that the state feared divine power. He portrayed himself as a modern apostle persecuted for obedience, drawing deliberate parallels between his experiences and the book of Acts. and the public listened. Not everyone believed his theology, but many believed his sincerity. More importantly, many believed the testimonies. Sick men and women stood outside police stations claiming they had been healed. Families followed Dowie from courthouse to meeting hall. Some even welcomed arrest alongside him, singing hymns while officers tried to restore order. This was no longer just a preacher in trouble. This was a movement. Medical journals denounced him. Editorials accused him of exploiting the desperate. Pastors distanced themselves, fearing guilt by association. But Dowie responded to critics with relentless confidence. He published pamphlets. He launched his own newspaper, Leaves of Healing, which circulated testimonies by the tens of thousands. The paper did more than report miracles, it built an alternative reality. In Dowie's world, sickness was not neutral. It was an enemy. Doctors were not villains, but they were mistaken, and the modern church, in his view, had lost its nerve. It had spiritualized what God intended to be tangible. This framing made Dowie dangerous, not because he claimed healing but because he claimed certainty. Authorities could tolerate faith that comforted people after loss. They could not tolerate faith that promised victory over loss itself. That kind of expectation destabilized systems built on managing suffering rather than eliminating it. So the pressure intensified, police raids increased, meeting permits were revoked, healing homes were inspected repeatedly. At one point, Dowie was arrested simply for praying too loudly. Yet the more the state pressed down, the more Dowie pressed forward. He began holding massive outdoor services. When halls were closed, he preached in streets. When streets were blocked, he rented tents. When tents were banned, he sent evangelists door to door, and everywhere he went, stories followed. A woman cured of tuberculosis, a man freed from lifelong paralysis, a child restored after doctors gave up hope. Again, belief is not required to recognize impact. The volume alone mattered. Tens of thousands claimed change. And in an era before social media, such scale was impossible without something extraordinary fueling it. Dowie interpreted it as divine endorsement. That interpretation marked a turning point. Where once he had spoken cautiously emphasizing prayer and obedience, his language began to sharpen. He no longer described healing as something God might do. He described it as something God would do, provided conditions were met. And those conditions increasingly flowed through him. Followers began to speak of Dowie not merely as a preacher, but as a vessel. Some whispered that his prayers worked where others failed. Some traveled hundreds of miles just to touch him. Others refused medical treatment entirely, insisting Dowie's ministry was sufficient. This alarmed even sympathetic observers. What if someone died? That question haunted every headline. And eventually, it would find an answer that critics seized upon. Several highly publicized deaths occurred among Dowie's followers, people who had refused medical intervention. Newspapers erupted. Prosecutors returned with renewed ferocity. This time, the charges were heavier, the tone darker. Dowie was accused of blood guilt. He responded with defiance. Did Christ kill the sick he prayed for? He asked publicly, or did unbelief kill them? Such statements deepened the divide. To supporters, he was courageous. To opponents, he was reckless. The line between faith and fanaticism blurred dangerously, and yet astonishingly, his influence continued to grow. It was during this season of relentless pressure that Dowie conceived his most radical idea yet. If cities would not tolerate him, he would build his own, a city governed by divine law. A city free from doctors, drugs, alcohol, and vice. A city where healing was normal, not controversial. It sounded impossible. It sounded insane. But Dowie had never measured possibility by consensus. The arrests that were meant to end him had instead convinced him of something profound. That compromise with existing systems was impossible. If God's order truly opposed the world's order, then separation was not optional, it was necessary. That conviction would soon give birth to one of the most audacious religious experiments in American history. And in the next section, we will watch Dowie take the money, loyalty, and momentum forged in conflict and use them to construct an entire city dedicated to divine healing. A city that would elevate him to unmatched power and place him closer than ever to his own unraveling. By the end of the 1890s, John Alexander Dowie had reached a conclusion that would have sounded unthinkable to most Americans. If the world would not tolerate divine healing, then the world would have to be escaped. The arrests, the ridicule, the endless legal battles. To Dowie, these were not setbacks, they were confirmation. Confirmation that modern society was irreparably compromised, spiritually hostile, and structurally incapable of supporting what he believed God was restoring. Reform was no longer enough, separation was required, and so Dowie did something no healer before him had dared to attempt. He decided to build a city, not a metaphorical one, not a spiritual movement alone, but a literal, physical city governed by biblical principles, structured around divine healing, and insulated from what he viewed as the corruption of modern life. He called it Zion. The location was carefully chosen, a stretch of land north of Chicago, along Lake Michigan, quiet, remote enough to control, close enough to draw supporters. Dowie secretly purchased thousands of acres through intermediaries, knowing that if his name appeared publicly, prices would skyrocket and opposition would mobilize. When the announcement finally came, it shocked the nation. Zion City would be a theocratic community. Alcohol would be banned, tobacco forbidden, doctors excluded, pharmacies outlawed, hospitals unnecessary. Healing would come through prayer, obedience, and faith alone. To his followers, this was not extremism. It was refuge. Thousands responded. Families sold homes, workers abandoned jobs. Elderly believers liquidated savings. They poured money into Dowie's vision, buying property, investing in businesses, and relocating en masse. Within a short time, Zion City rose from empty land into a functioning municipality, factories, schools, housing, publishing houses, a massive tabernacle, streets named after biblical figures, rules governing dress, conduct, and even entertainment. And at the center of it all stood Dowie. He was not merely the founder, he was the final authority. Dowie held titles that reflected his expanding self-understanding: General Overseer, Restorer of Apostolic Christianity, Messenger of the Covenant. He did not claim to replace Christ, but he increasingly spoke as Christ's singular representative for the age. This was the paradox of Zion City. On one hand, it was an extraordinary achievement. In an era without modern infrastructure, Dowie coordinated logistics, finance, labor, and governance on a massive scale. He employed thousands. He provided housing. He created a social safety net for believers who had been marginalized elsewhere. Zion City was clean, orderly, alcohol-free. Crime was low. Many residents testified to improved health, not only physical, but moral and social. On the other hand, Zion City was rigid. Medical emergencies were spiritualized. Questioning leadership was discouraged. Outside media was restricted. Loyalty to Dowie was framed not merely as agreement, but as obedience to God, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the emphasis shifted. Where healing had once been the focus, authority became central. Dowie now controlled not just prayer meetings, but livelihoods. He determined who could work, who could stay, who must leave. Businesses were owned by the church. Wages flowed through the system. Tithes were mandatory. Finances centralized. Supporters saw protection. Critics saw control. The arrest stopped not because Dowie had softened his views, but because he had outmaneuvered his opponents. Within Zion's boundaries, he wrote the rules. No doctors meant no licensing conflicts. No pharmacies meant no inspections. He had created a legal buffer around his theology. For a time, it worked. Pilgrims visited from around the world. Leaders observed with fascination. Some even wondered whether Zion represented a new model of Christian society, one that addressed social decay through politics, but through spiritual restructuring. But absolute certainty has a cost. Dowie's preaching grew more absolute. He no longer spoke primarily of what God could do, but of what God must do. And when healings did not occur, blame was increasingly assigned not to mystery, but to disobedience, hidden sin, or insufficient loyalty. This pressure weighed heavily on residents. To admit illness was to risk judgment. To seek outside help was to risk expulsion. Some suffered silently, others left quietly. A few died publicly, reigniting criticism beyond Zion's borders, and yet Dowie pressed on. He traveled extensively, proclaiming Zion as proof of divine favor. He collected funds aggressively, promising expansion. He dreamed of global cities, Zions in every nation. His ambitions outpaced even his remarkable achievements. And then, the language changed again. Dowie began to speak not just as a leader, but as a prophetic figure with singular authority. He identified enemies not merely as mistaken, but as agents of Satan. He denounced other Christian leaders by name. He framed disagreement as rebellion. Supporters applauded. Detractors grew alarmed. The man who had once defied the state in defense of conscience now wielded unchecked power within his own domain. The healer who had comforted the sick now governed their futures. And power, once consolidated, demands protection. Financial mismanagement began to surface. Extravagant spending, unclear accounting, internal dissent quietly suppressed. Loyalists dismissed concerns as persecution. Critics warned of collapse. Dowie, convinced of his divine mandate, dismissed all warnings. But the body has limits, even one sustained by conviction. In 1905, Dowie suffered a massive stroke. The man who had preached divine health relentlessly now lay partially paralyzed, speech impaired, strength diminished. Authority weakened. The symbolism was devastating. Questions that had been forbidden suddenly flooded the city. If healing was guaranteed, why not now? If Dowie was chosen, why this? As Dowie retreated from public life, others stepped forward. Some sought reform, others sought control. The unity that had built Zion began to fracture. And in the silence left by Dowie's failing voice, the movement faced its most dangerous test. In the next section, we will witness the unraveling how illness, power struggles, and disillusionment exposed a fragile foundation beneath absolute certainty, and how the man arrested for healing the sick would face the one crisis he could not command away. When John Alexander Dowie collapsed under the weight of his own body in 1905, the shock rippled far beyond Zion City. This was not merely a medical emergency. It was a theological crisis. For decades, Dowie had preached divine health with unwavering certainty. Sickness, he insisted, was not God's will. Healing was not occasional, it was promised. The faithful were to live above disease, not submit to it. And now the man who had defied doctors, mocked medicine, and declared illness an enemy, lay partially paralyzed. His speech slurred, his mobility impaired, his authority weakened in front of the very community he had trained never to expect this outcome. At first, loyalists responded with denial. They insisted the stroke was temporary. They framed it as spiritual warfare. They blamed exhaustion, overwork, even demonic resistance. Prayer vigils were organized, fasting intensified, prophecies were circulated promising full restoration. But the days passed, and Dowie did not rise. The silence that followed was more damaging than any sermon he had ever preached. In Zion City, where sickness had been framed as failure of faith, failure of obedience, the sight of their leader struggling to walk was unbearable. If Dowie could fall, anyone could. That realization destabilized everything. Behind the scenes, power shifted quickly. Administrators who had long operated under Dowie's shadow now stepped into the light. Some were sincere caretakers trying to preserve order. Others saw opportunity. Control of finances, property, and governance suddenly mattered more than theology. Zion City had been built on centralized authority, and now that authority was compromised, Dowie attempted to maintain control from his sickbed. He issued statements, he denounced critics. He insisted his illness did not invalidate divine healing. But his voice no longer carried the same weight. Confidence, once absolute, now sounded defensive. Worse still, revelations began to surface. Financial records, once unquestioned, were scrutinized. The vast donations that had funded Zion's expansion were found to be poorly managed. Debt mounted, businesses faltered, promised expansions never materialized. Followers who had sacrificed everything began to ask uncomfortable questions. Where had the money gone? Why were leaders living comfortably while workers struggled? Why were dissenters being expelled rather than heard? For years, critics outside Zion had accused Dowie of authoritarian control. Now, insiders were beginning to agree the theological framework that had protected Dowie also worked against him. By teaching that obedience brought blessing and disobedience brought consequences, he had unintentionally trained his followers to interpret his own suffering as a verdict. Some whispered that God was correcting him. Others feared he had overstepped divine boundaries. A few began to say openly what had once been unthinkable, that Dowie had gone too far. Into this vacuum stepped a man who would seal Dowie's downfall. Wilbur Glenn Verlever, once Dowie's trusted lieutenant, emerged as a decisive force. Verlever had administrative skill, ambition, and little patience for ambiguity. Where Dowie ruled by charisma and theology, Verlever ruled by structure and control, and he acted swiftly. Claiming Dowie was mentally and physically unfit to lead, Verlever orchestrated a legal takeover of Zion City's governance. Boards were reorganized, authority transferred. Dowie was removed not gently, but decisively from leadership. The healer who had built a city was exiled from his own creation. The irony was devastating. Dowie, once arrested by the state for healing the sick, was now stripped of power by the community he had formed to escape that very state. The man who had refused medical help now required care. The leader who had preached certainty now lived in dependence. In his final years, Dowie was largely isolated. His health never fully recovered. His influence waned. Zion City continued, but without him, and increasingly without the healing emphasis that had defined its birth. When Dowie died in 1907, the reactions were deeply divided. Supporters mourned him as a misunderstood prophet, a man ahead of his time, persecuted for obedience, undone by exhaustion rather than error. They remembered the healings, the hope, the courage to challenge systems that profited from suffering. Critics, however, saw his death as confirmation, a cautionary tale of unchecked authority, theological absolutism, and the dangers of conflating personal conviction with divine mandate. Both sides were partly right. Dowie was neither merely a fraud nor purely a martyr. He was a complex figure, visionary, courageous, authoritarian, sincere, and flawed. He exposed the limitations of both medicine and faith when either refuses humility. Perhaps most haunting of all is this: Dowie's message outlived him. Though Zion City faded from prominence, the divine healing movement did not. Ideas he popularized resurfaced in later Pentecostal and charismatic revivals. Healing evangelists borrowed his language. Movements echoed his convictions, sometimes learning from his failures, sometimes repeating them. In that sense, Dowie never truly disappeared. His life raises questions that still trouble modern faith communities. Where does faith end and presumption begin? Who holds leaders accountable when belief shields them from scrutiny? And what happens when spiritual certainty leaves no room for mystery? Dowie believed with his whole being that God desired to heal the sick. That belief gave hope to thousands. It also built a system that could not survive contradiction. And contradiction came not from enemies, but from the human body itself. In the final section, we will step back and examine Dowie's legacy with clarity rather than sentiment. We will ask what his life teaches not only about healing, but about power, conviction, and the thin line between faith that liberates and faith that controls. Because John Alexander Dowie was not just arrested for healing the sick, he was remembered for forcing the world to confront a question it still has not answered. What do we do when belief works, until it doesn't? When history remembers John Alexander Dowie, it rarely knows where to place him. He does not fit neatly amongst us, and he resists classification as a simple charlatan. He was too sincere to dismiss easily, and too flawed to canonize safely. His life sits in the uncomfortable middle where conviction collides with consequence, and where faith, once unrestrained, reveals both its power and its peril. Dowie forced the modern world to confront a question it preferred to avoid. What if healing was not merely psychological comfort, but a lived expectation? At the end of the 19th century, medicine was advancing rapidly, yet unevenly. Antibiotics had not arrived. Surgery was still dangerous. Many treatments harmed as much as they helped. In that context, Dowie's message resonated not because it was exotic, but because it addressed a genuine vacuum. He did not invent desperation, he answered it. For thousands, Dowie represented dignity in suffering. He spoke to the sick as participants, not problems. He insisted they were not burdens to be managed, but people God had not abandoned. That alone was revolutionary. Even critics conceded that his ministry restored hope to those the system had written off. And hope, once awakened, is difficult to contain. Yet Dowie's tragedy was not that he believed God healed. It was that he eventually believed too much about himself. The early Dowie prayed with humility. He emphasized obedience, repentance, and trust. Healing was central, but it was not yet weaponized. Over time, however, success hardened certainty, opposition sharpened rhetoric, and necessity, the need to defend his ministry, slowly transformed conviction into absolutism. He stopped saying God heals and began implying God heals through disorder. That shift mattered. When faith allows no room for failure, failure becomes heresy. When leaders become the guardians of divine approval, disagreement becomes rebellion. And when outcomes are guaranteed, mystery becomes unacceptable. Dowie's system could not absorb contradiction. His own illness exposed that weakness brutally. The theology that empowered thousands now trapped them. If healing was always available, why did it not come now? If obedience ensured blessing, who had failed? Instead of allowing the tension to refine his message, Dowie resisted it. He doubled down. And in doing so, he lost the very flexibility that might have preserved his legacy intact. But history is rarely fair in its simplicity. The movements that followed Dowie, Pentecostal revivals, charismatic healing ministries, modern faith movement, so in more than they often admit, he normalized the idea that healing belonged in public worship. He forced churches to revisit neglected scriptures. He demonstrated that belief, when mobilized, could build institutions, cities, and cultures. Even his failures became lessons, though not all learned them. Some successors embraced humility, acknowledging mystery alongside expectation. Others repeated his mistakes, building empires immune to correction. Dowie's shadow stretches across both paths. So how should he be remembered? Not as a villain who deceived the masses. To many, genuine testimonies contradict that. Not as a flawless prophet. His collapse forbids it. He should be remembered as a warning and an invitation. A warning that spiritual power without accountability corrodes both leader and follower. An invitation to believe boldly without surrendering discernment. Dowie's life reminds us that faith can challenge systems, but it must also submit to truth. That miracles, even when real, do not excuse control. And that sincerity is not the same as infallibility. Perhaps his greatest contribution is this uncomfortable insight. That belief is most dangerous, not when it is weak, but when it is certain, because certainty demands consistency. And life is rarely consistent. Dowie wanted a world without sickness. He dreamed of a society healed from the inside out. In that dream, there was beauty. There was courage. There was genuine compassion. But there was also fear of ambiguity, fear of questions without answers, fear that admitting uncertainty might unravel everything, and so the system broke instead. In the end, John Alexander Dowie died, as every human does, limited, fragile, dependent. The healer was not healed in the way he had promised others. And that fact unsettles believers and skeptics alike. Yet maybe that is precisely where his story becomes most honest, because it reminds us that faith is not proven only by outcomes, but by integrity when outcomes disappoint. That healing, when real, is a gift, not a weapon. And that leaders must never become the measure of the message they preach. Dowie was arrested nearly 100 times for healing the sick, but he will be remembered far longer for forcing us to ask whether faith can remain powerful without becoming absolute, and whether conviction can inspire without enslaving. Those questions remain unanswered, and that may be his final, enduring miracle. The story of John Alexander Dowie does not end with a miracle or a scandal, it ends with a question. What do we do when belief challenges systems, and when systems push back? Dowie dared to believe that healing was still possible, and for thousands, that belief restored hope where none existed. Yet his life also reminds us that conviction, when left unchecked, can harden into control. He was arrested for healing the sick. He built a city around faith, and he fell under the weight of certainty itself. This is not a story asking you to accept or reject his theology, but to wrestle honestly with its implications. Because the line between faith that liberates and faith that dominates is thinner than we think. If this story made you think, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves untold history. And most importantly, drop a comment below. What do you think Dowie's story really teaches us?